Thanks, Robbie. So I would like to take a moment right now, a few moments actually, to honor and remember our dear friend and colleague, Bob Badukian. As many of you know, Bob passed away on August 30th after a courageous battle with cancer. He was not only an icon in the flavor and fragrance industry, but also a cherished friend to us all. Bob's journey with RIFM began in 1989. Some of you may not have been born then. And over the next 33 years, he was a board member until 2022. He made an indelible mark on our organization, serving as chair of the board from 2005 to 2007, and as interim co-president from 2015 to 2016. Bob's leadership and vision were pivotal in shaping RIFM's success. And even as he led his family's company, Badukian Research Incorporated, to new heights, he remained a steadfast supporter of our mission. Bob's contributions extended far beyond our industry. He was an inventor or co-inventor on about 80 patents, which is an awful lot, reflecting his innovative spirit. His philanthropic efforts touched many lives, including his support for Ability Beyond, which honored him in 2018 with the Robert S. Young Humanitarian Award. He also established the Nuvance Research and Innovation Badukian Endowed Chair and served on various prestigious committees, including the Purdue University Chemistry Advisory Committee, which recognized him with the Distinguished Alumni Award in 2013. Purdue University is where Bob received his PhD. In 2015, Bob received the Eric Bruell Distinguished Service Award from the Fragrance Creators Association. And in 2020, he was honored by the Association of Religious Communities for his service. He and his family's pride and dedication to their heritage was evident in his role on the Armenian Museum of America Board of Trustees. And in 2021, he was awarded the Greater Danbury Good Scout Award, which I love. Yay, Bob. In recognition of Bob's extraordinary impact, the RIFM Board of Directors has renamed its Excellence in Science Award to the Robert Badukian Excellence in Science Award. This tribute is a fitting reflection of the profound respect and admiration we all hold for Bob, who will forever be the only Dr. Bob. Just have a moment of silence before we continue. Thank you. Okay, and now before I summarize RIFM's achievements, or a true summary of the achievements over the past year, I want to take a moment to recognize a key individual whose dedication has been instrumental to our success, our President, Anne-Marie Appy. I hope this is a huge surprise. Please, please.
It is.
Yeah, great. Anne-Marie's journey with RIFM began 40 years ago as a scientific assistant.
When I was 5.
She was 5 years old. And over the decades, because it is decades,
Yep.
she has grown into a pillar of both our organization and the fragrance industry at large. Her remarkable career is marked by significant milestones, including completing her MS and PhD degrees in toxicology and becoming a fellow of the Academy of Toxicological Sciences. Receiving such prestigious awards as the Woman of the Year by the Women in Flavor and Fragrance Commerce in 2006 and the Philippe Schubik Distinguished Scientist Award in 2018. The Philippe Schubik Award is given to individuals like Anne-Marie who have made outstanding contributions to toxicology, demonstrating excellence in both traditional and regulatory toxicology. Who knew there were two different parts? And who have supported and mentored others in the field. This honor reflects Anne-Marie's dedication not only to her own research, but also to nurturing the next generation of toxicologists. In addition to her leadership at RIFM, Anne-Marie is also a part-time assistant professor at Rutgers, further showcasing her commitment to advancing the field of toxicology and mentoring future professionals. Please join me right now in congratulating Anne-Marie on her 40 incredible years at RIFM. I'm not done. Your contributions have been invaluable, and I am confident that with your continued leadership, the best is truly yet to come. Thank you, Anne-Marie. So we have a little plaque. I hope it's got the right years on it. Yeah. It's September 2024, and a little gift for you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
A surprise? Good. I love to surprise people. So, RIFM is at a pivotal moment of growth and achievement, and we are progressing well towards completing our groundbreaking programs. Our Natural Complex Substances NCS program is close to completing the first round of 500 materials, implying, of course, that there will be other rounds coming. Our work on these 500 materials is setting new benchmarks in fragrance material safety and will directly influence global fragrance standards. There are roughly 300 discrete chemically defined fragrance materials that remain to be completed. Anne-Marie will provide more details during her talk a little bit later today, but we are progressing well. On the research side of our work, the RIFM low exposure paper was published earlier this year and has received more attention than any other RIFM publication. This paper will have, and is already having, a significant impact on communication by the fragrance industry, especially those people talking to regulators. As we continue this critical work, we face rising costs. I think every year I've come up here I've said that. But it's gotten actually really bad. We face rising costs, especially in testing, which are now 30 to 60% higher since the pandemic. It's due to closures of labs, the normal stuff, a little bit of inflation here and there, but 30 to 60% for testing. To ensure we maintain our pace and quality of work, we're requesting your support through a special assessment to dues. I appreciate your understanding and support as we navigate these increased costs. This would be the first dues increase in 16 years. Your contributions are vital to ensuring RIFM's continued success. Together, we have built a strong foundation, and with your help, we will continue to lead the way in fulfilling our mission, ensuring the safety, providing a scientific basis, we never need to forget that, for the safe use of fragrance, for the protection of consumers and the environment. So we need to continue to ensure the safe use of fragrance materials. And that's what this is all about. So I'm going to turn it over to Anne-Marie now. Or Robbie. Whatever. I didn't follow the script. Come on up, Robbie. Yeah.
Okay. Well, still need to work. So, as Bob mentioned, we start with truly last year with some of the NCS program. So you will see this year annual treasury report located on page 18 and 19 in the annual meeting brochure. So, if there is any question, please go ahead. So we will now move to the 2025 due schedule. If there are no questions, we will proceed with the membership adoption of the proposed 2025 dues schedule, which was previously provided to all members. So, unless any active or supporting members desire a vote by ballot, I will accept a motion and second for a voice vote of active and supporting members to approve the 2025 proposed dues schedules. Approve. Second. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay. So we will move now to the 2025 dues assessment. So as Bob mentioned, to complete the first phase of the NCS testing by 2028, which is the deadline that the board set up, and in light of the increased cost of testing, the board of directors has approved a dues assessment of 15% for 2025, with the expectation that the first phase of the NCS testing will be completed by 2028. If there is no question, we can proceed with the membership adoption of the proposed 2025 15% dues assessment. Unless any active or supporting member desires a vote by ballot, I will accept a motion and second for a voice vote of active and supporting members to approve the 2025 15% dues assessment. Okay. Any second? All in favor? Any opposed? No. It's good. Bob?
I was hiding behind the TV in case they were going to throw stuff at you for the dues assessment. So thanks for all of your understanding in approving that dues assessment, and rest assured that the staff and the board take the financing and the finances of RIFM very seriously and are moving quite quickly on the testing that we have to do. We will now proceed to the election of directors, officers, and executive committee members in accordance with the bylaws of the Institute. And as chair of the nominating committee, I will now read the list of nominees. So if you're here and you hear your name, it shouldn't be a surprise. Just raise your hand or stand up. So Dilo Bischoff from BASF is not here. Chris Choi, Taksago. George Daher, Estee Lauder. Suzanne Kettler, DSM Firmenich, is not here today. Bhuvana Nageshwaran is at home in India. From Ultra, Andy O'Shea Berger is back there. Nick Pickthall, CPL Aromas. Rodolphe Carew from IFF is here. Cindy Reichert from Aryl Essence. Veronique Skater from Chanel is in France. Klaus Oliver Schmidt is Simrise. Ron Stark from Bell. Maurizio Volpe Givaudan is not here. Myself from Robertet, and Michael Zobel from Lanxess is not here. Kedar Vaze from Keva is as well. Okay. Are there any other nominations? If no. Unless any active or oh, yeah. The officers, yeah, right. You want me to read the whole page? Yeah, okay. That was the board of directors. The officers. Chair, myself, Bob Weinstein, Robertet. Vice Chair, Ron Stark from Bell. Treasurer, Chris Choi, Taksago. Secretary, George Daher from Estee Lauder. The executive committee. Myself, from Robertet, Chris Choi. Bhuvana Nageshwaran from Ultra, George Daher from Estee Lauder, and Maurizio Volpe from Givaudan. I assure you those not here have all agreed, and we're just not naming them in their absence. So, which would actually be pretty funny. Are there any other nominations? Okay, unless any active or supporting member desires a vote by ballot, I will accept a motion and a second for a voice vote of active and supporting members to elect those nominees to the RIFM's Board of Directors, officers, and members of RIFM's Executive Committee as I have read them. Do I have a second? Cindy, thank you. And Andy, thank you. All in favor? Yay. Anybody against? No. Very good. Thank you all very much for another year. You're providing us another year of our leadership. Anne Marie, President of RIFM, entering her 41st year of service to the organization, will now present the President's report. Anne Marie?
Thank you. So I'd like to start off first by thanking all of our sponsors. We really appreciate your support for this meeting, so thank you. And through meticulous detail in the scientific endeavors at RIFM, we continue a legacy of collaboration and objectivity. And there's certainly a lot of hard work by all of our staff members because our priority now, as Bob just said, is completing the safety assessments. And I have really good news because we're celebrating. We have passed more than 2,000 published safety assessments on 2,000 materials. In fact, Gary told me this morning that it's 2020. So we are really starting the celebration tonight for 2000 and onward. And of course, this doesn't get done by one or two people. It's a whole staff effort. We could not make it possible without them, and I'm very fortunate to have a wonderful staff. And so I'm going to ask the staff to please stand up so that we can congratulate you because this is your accomplishment. So thank you. So in addition to the more than 2,000 that we've published, as Bob mentioned earlier, we have about 300 discrete chemicals to complete. And within the first round NCSs, there's roughly 550 materials that we're already working on and working very diligently to complete and having all the testing done by 2028 or before. This is not done either without the expert panel for fragrance safety. They are the main reason that we remain, our science is objective and independent because everything we do, all of our research, planning, results, safety assessment conclusions are approved by the expert panel. They meet 3 times a year, so they've already met in January and May of this year, and we'll have another meeting in a couple of weeks. They have also added a couple of new members. Mark Cronin from the university, John Moore's University in Liverpool, is being added. He is an expert in silico and chemistry and also has an environmental sciences background. And the other expert that they added was Aldred Piersma, who is from RIVM, not to be confused with RIFM, which is the Public Health and Environment of the Netherlands, RIVM. His expertise is in reproductive toxicology and with a specialty in looking at animal alternatives to investigate reproductive and developmental techniques. We also are sad to say goodbye to an expert panel member, and that's Terry Schultz, and his last meeting will be in a few weeks in September, but he's decided that it was time for him to move on. But certainly all of the progress that we've made in the chemistry area is in large thanks to Terry. I remind you that the panel independently selects members of the panel that would be members of the group. The other thing that's happened over the last year is that the Board of Directors has reviewed our vision, mission, and values, and that has now been completed, and we've actually tweaked them a little bit, but of course, we follow all of these in everything that we do. So the vision is RIFM's leadership in state-of-the-art science enables the enjoyment of fragrances around the world. And the mission is RIFM Science and Research builds international trust and acceptance in the safe use of fragrance materials. And of course, it's for our values, it's scientific excellence, objectivity, integrity, and leadership, collaboration as much as we can, and transparency in everything we do. And for the transparency, I think it's really important to remember that there are other pillars. The first, of course, is the expert panel. The second one is that we follow internationally accepted guidelines for testing. The third, and that was also by demand of the expert panel, is that all of our science is published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. And the fourth one, which is key to transparency, is that all of this is made available, open access, or on the Resource Center. And this has gone a long way in convincing others that our science is transparent and everything that we do is achievable without hiding behind anything. It's all there for everyone to see. And the first goal, of course, is to complete the safety assessments. And I think in addition to the 300 discrete chemicals, the 550 naturals, there's also a program that you may or may not be aware of, but all of our safety assessments are reviewed every 5 years. Thankfully, most of them don't have to be updated. I think it's about 30%. I'm looking at Danielle, right? 30% that have to be updated. So you'll notice the title of those safety assessments begin update. And now we have 2 materials that will go through the second update. So you'll see update number 2. And then the title of the material. And I think that's key also. So this is not a one and done process. This is going to go on all the time because science is always evolving. Science is always changing, and we have to keep up with it. The second goal is advancing our science. And here's where our research plays such a big role. Our research really focuses on looking at new approach methods. How can we improve the methods that we already have? We're not doing any animal testing in the human health area, working towards a goal of eliminating fish testing in the environment area. We'll hear more from Aurelia later. So these are important parts. And of course, everyone is talking about AI. So how can we incorporate that? How can we use this new technology to our benefit without it being abused? The connections that you cannot do a risk assessment without hazard and exposure is something we're passionate about. We do safety assessments. That's what we do. So those 2 key elements are part of it. And making that a first priority where the whole world seems to be moving towards hazard is a goal for us. And then, of course, engaging with other scientists. And that's not just regulatory scientists, but academicians, some of our peers, certainly you, our members, are also part of that. And then finally, the last goal is the impact of our science. So we've learned that science that's not communicated is science that doesn't exist. So how can we translate our science to those who are not toxicologists? How can we explain it better? How can we make it plainer? How can we talk to people to show them what the impact of our science is? Another part of it is talking to you, our members, so that you understand the impact of what we're doing and can use it in your day-to-day businesses. And finally, talking to scientists around the world, including, of course, the regulatory scientists. And there we rely on our partners like Fragrance Creators Association, who help us to introduce us to those people who are doing this work and that we can talk to them about what we do. So moving on to that, one of the developments over the last year was interaction that we've had with the US EPA. And that's been something that's also been facilitated through FCA. And they have been very interested in the biodegradation data that we have. Aurelia has summarized all of this data. We made the summary available to them. And of course, as a regulatory agency, they need to see the reports as well. So we've transmitted 50 reports. And just within the last few weeks, we've transmitted another 35. Reports. The good news there is that they are interested in developing another in silico model to predict biodegradation based on the data that we are providing them. So just another great example of cooperation. We also broke several communication records over the last year. It's sometimes just, I think because of some of the influences that you've had, we've had mentioned in an article in Vogue that we had absolutely nothing to do with, but they knew about RIFM and mentioned that we have a safety program. Our own Nikita Sadekar was interviewed for an article in The Cut. And of course, the low exposure paper, which has received dozens of media pickups since January of this year. I've been interviewed, Isabel Lee has also been interviewed for this. We've getting a lot of interest in that paper, and it really shows that the low exposure to fragrance materials. We've also continued to have webinars. You know, this started, of course, because during the pandemic, but we found that this is a great way to reach a large number of people. And we've done this with a group in India, where we got up real early in the morning for them, and we've also been to talk to Mercosur in South America. And so this is another way to engage a lot of people at one time. And so if you know of a group, if you've interacted with a group, whether that's a customer company or anyone else that you think we could help you with or benefit from hearing about the science that we do, please let us know. Because this is a great way for our staff to get together and talk about our science and let others know what we're doing. In addition to that, we're being asked to present at various meetings around the world. And so these are just some of the countries that we've been in over the last year, talking about various research projects and things that we do. And we also see this same trend increasing for next year. So for us, it's always managing the budget and, of course, the safety assessment process that we have to do. But it's nice for us to be able to speak about our science and reach different audiences. We had a booth for the very first time in RIFM's history at the World Perfumery Congress at the last week of June. And it was, we developed 2 brochures for this meeting. We have copies of those brochures here, so please take a copy of them. One is to try to attract new members to RIFM. The other one is about what we do. Additionally, we distributed we were fortunate enough in that Perfumer and Flavorist had the interview that Isabel and I gave about the low exposure paper, and that was featured in the May issue, which was then put into all the tote bags that the attendees received. We also had that at our booth. So that was another great way of getting out information at the WPC to a different audience for us. So I've talked about exposure, and I found this paper that was published in 1966 by the very first president of RIFM, Tom Parks, in which he said, "Another thing to remember is that we have a very low concentration of any one of our perfume ingredients remaining on the body after the use of soap or cosmetics." So in 58 years, we're still talking about low exposure. The only difference is the way we're measuring exposure. So that has changed over the years. And this was really through a partnership that we had with CREM Global, and we developed the CREM RIFM aggregate exposure model, which plays a strategic role in our safety assessments. It is the most realistic exposure and the most comprehensive of its kind. We have not found another model like this in the world. And we'll learn more about that a little bit later. And I think the challenge that we face is that most people feel that if you can detect an odor, there must be a lot of it there. And in fact, that's not true. The good news is that now we have the data to show that. And we know that the safe use level is much larger than where your exposure is, which is what you want in toxicology. We've also had some recently published papers that have research papers that have been really important on the environmental side, the species sensitivity analysis, which was done on OTNE. So these assays are a common tool that's used for setting safe limits on chemical concentrations in surface water. This is the first one that we have done, and it really is a milestone kind of paper, so we're quite proud of that. You'll be reading more about that in a future email summary. And we've also had on the skin sensitization side, quite a lot of activity. Some recently accepted papers. We had one where we collaborated with IFF on the GUARD dose response assay. Isabel has just had another paper that was recently submitted. Yak Stacker has had a couple of gene tox papers recently, so you'll be hearing more about them in the coming weeks. Really proud of that work. You'll also hear more later on about framework, the environmental framework, which we call Framework 2.0, which is our criteria document on the environmental side. And we are updating the mechanistic domains for skin sensitization. So skin sensitization, the mechanistic domains was developed about 20 years ago. Next year will be 20 years. So we're looking at different domains, and we also are looking at updating that paper in the near future. And Jake Muldoon and Holger Mustakas are working on submitting another paper on chemical similarity, and that should be going in for submission, or is in submission at this point, for publication. Finally, as a reminder, the third annual Science Symposium is going to be on November the 6th, Wednesday, November the 6th, beginning at 8 o'clock in the morning, 8 to noon. So this is a free event. It's all virtual. So please invite your colleagues, invite your customers. It's a great opportunity to hear some of what we're doing, and also to be able to ask questions of our staff, because we'll have sessions where the staff will be there and you can ask questions online. And finally, we're also planning to have another INFOX. We haven't had one in some time, which is planned for Paris in the fall of 2025. This also came out of discussions that we had with the board in reviewing our goals. And so this will be an in-person meeting. It's a great opportunity to have the staff talk about our research projects, an update on where the science program is going, and interact with our scientists. We'll also have several expert panel members there as well. So I'll pause now to see if you have any questions for me. Okay, if not, it's now time to give the RIFM President's Award. So it's given to a staff member whose work has most significantly contributed to the success of the organization over the last year. It's really a very nice award because staff votes for the person, and I'm really pleased this year to say that the award is going to Dr. Isabel Lee. I know how to do it. So Isabel is a senior scientist at RIFM. She leads the skin sensitization team, and as I said, she also took on the added task of summarizing and analyzing all of the exposure data. So she wanted a challenge, and I'm not sure whether she was happy about that, but yeah, so thank you, Isabel. Thank you. And now for the 2024 Board of Directors Excellence in Science Award. And as Bob recently said, beginning in 2025, this award will now be called the Robert Badukian Excellence in Science Award. And I couldn't think of a better way for RIFM to honor Bob for all of his years of service, because he was a dedicated scientist and really dedicated to RIFM. So we're really pleased to do this in memory of him. It acknowledges outstanding contributions to the science supporting the safe use of fragrances. And this year, the award goes to Bob Safford. So Bob Safford, there's too many Bobs, spent his career at Unilever. And we were fortunate enough that after Bob retired from Unilever, he was consulting. And so we worked with him on several projects, including the quantitative risk assessment for skin sensitization, the CREM RIFM aggregate exposure model, and also really important for us because it's a strategic part of what we do is the dermal sensitization threshold. Bob had developed the DST for non-reactive chemicals, And then we wanted to use it in our safety assessments and asked him to help us develop it for reactive chemicals, and it kind of progressed from there. There were several publications coming from that. So please help me in congratulating Bob. Your slide should be up there, so you can just advance.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd just like to say how honoured and delighted I am to receive this award. It came to me as a bit of a shock because I haven't worked with RIFM for nearly 4 years now. I'm completely phased out of all of that. So Anne-Marie's email was good news, a bit of a shock, but good news for me. Anne-Marie asked me if I'd give a quick presentation of my achievements. So I've been looking back over the years to see, you know, exactly what it is that I've done. I thought I'd start at the very beginning. I've called this presentation Chance, Risk and Probability because that's essentially what's got me up here today. So I'm going to go right back to the very beginning. Can I? So as Anne-Marie said, in 1970, I joined Unilever. I was 16 years old. I left school not because I wanted to, but because my parents couldn't afford to keep me in school. So I had to go and earn my keep, as it were. I was really interested in science, and I was always the nerd that was reading The New Scientist when all my friends were playing football. So I needed to find a job that I would be happy with in science, and I also needed to find a job that I could get to. So it had to be within close proximity of where I lived so that I could get there on my bicycle or get a bus. So the options were fairly limited, I have to say. Not so far away was an establishment called the Royal Aircraft Establishment, where they carried out aeronautical research and development. It sounded very interesting. I interviewed there, and it was really interesting. There was also somewhere close by where they made plastics and polymers, and had a research facility there. I also interviewed there, and that also sounded interesting. The final option I had was with Unilever at the research laboratory at Colworth House. When I went to interview there, that became a favourite, chiefly because they ran coaches from all of the surrounding villages and towns, so I could get there easily enough. And the other plus on that one was that they were keen to people to carry on further education. So I would get to go to a local university or college and continue getting qualifications. So in 1970, I joined their biology division, which was the name of their consumer safety department at the time, and I joined there as an animal technician. I had a number of roles over the following years, but then I seem to have lost the date on that one. I think it was around 1997 that I became a product group scientist. It's one of those job titles that means nothing and doesn't tell you anything about what I was doing, but essentially it was a product safety scientist. So I was looking after the safety of Unilever's dental products at the time, and that's when I started to learn the art of risk assessment. And I call it an art because I've always regarded it as an art. It's much too complicated to be a science. So what is risk? Risk is the chance or probability that a person will be harmed or experience an adverse effect when exposed to a hazard. And I've highlighted the words chance and probability, and I'm going to be talking quite a lot about probability as we go through the presentation. So this looks scary. It is scary, but the two points about risk assessment is you need to determine the hazard, you need to determine the exposure. And Anne-Marie's already talked about this. But the hazard side is the toxicology. That's where we identify the toxicity of a chemical using animals. We also determine the dose, and we try and find a dose where that toxic effect doesn't occur in animals. We can extrapolate then to an acceptable intake in humans. At the exposure side relies on consumer use of the product, how much do they use, and frequency, and we come up with consumer exposure. If the right-hand side is less than the left-hand side, everything's hunky-dory. Back in the day, we would spend a hell of a lot of time looking at the hazard. We had loads of pathologists, histologists, biochemists, and so on, working on that side of things. The exposure side was almost, well, we'll have a guesstimate as to what the exposure is. So essentially, how much shampoo can you get on the palm of your hand when you shampoo your hair, and how often do you shampoo your hair? But obviously, everyone's different. The only plus side of that is that we tended to make that assessment over the top. But of course, if you don't get the exposure right, then the risk assessment's wrong. As simple as that. So I always thought that we needed to do something more on the exposure side. There was a bit of a revelation back in 2004 when I had the pleasure of going over to Dublin, flying over to Dublin to see a presentation from a group of people from Trinity College, headed up by Cronin McNamara. It was a cold, rainy day, and as I was going there, I was thinking, what the hell am I doing here? I had no idea what I was going to see. But they gave a presentation on a model that they'd built to estimate dietary exposure to food components. They use a method called Monte Carlo, which I'm not going to go into because it would take far too long. But the key thing here is that I was absolutely bowled over when I saw this. This was exactly what we needed to do to assess consumer exposure. And I was really so excited. I went back to work and I said, we have to have this model. Unfortunately, it was about 12 months before Cronin got his act together and actually formed a company to make this available to everybody. At the time, I was working with a group, working group that Kalipa had set up, which was designed to collect and collate data on consumer exposure. The idea being that we needed to know more about consumer exposure, and we needed to get data to do that. We'd studied 12 different products. We were able to get frequency of use data from some very large consumer panels, which essentially were set up by marketing research organization. But that didn't include any data on how much people used. So we commissioned 2 studies in which we measured how much people were using. And as you can imagine, the marketing research panels were thousands of people. The studies that we commissioned were smaller, but there was a huge amount of data which came out of that. And we needed someone who could analyze that data and turn that into distributions of how much product people are exposed to every day. And of course, CREM software was an ideal solution to that. It was called CREM software now, I know it's called CREM Global. But we were able to get these distributions, and we were able to provide them to the Scientific Committee on Consumer Safety, and they included them in their notes of guidance in 2010. And just a quick look, this is an example of a distribution that was produced by the model, and you can see there the dotted line gives you where the 90th percentile is, and if you come down to the amount in grams per day, you get roughly 10.4 grams per day, and that's the figure that the SCCS have in their notes of guidance. Around the same time, I was approached by a colleague and friend, David Basketer, who some of you may know, and he said to me he was involved with RIFM on an expert group which was looking into a method of quantitative risk assessment for sensitizers, and he said he thought it would be a good idea if I joined the group. I found this quite daunting, partly because I didn't consider myself to be an expert, and also because I didn't know who the hell RIFM was. But I soon found out. I decided that it was up my street, so I joined that group. And as Anne-Marie has said, we went on to develop the QRA, which became QRA1. And I have to put the disclaimer up about that QRA is protective for skin sensitizing people and not for skin reactions in people who are already sensitized. That was published in 2008. I know it was adopted by RIFM and IFRA at that time, and was also used to set IFRA standards. Some of the titles are missing from these, so I apologize for that. This is just a quick overview of the risk assessment that QRA1 produced. It looks pretty similar to the one that I showed you earlier. So you have determination of what we called a NESL. We have the application of safety factors. So we extrapolate from the NESL to the human population by applying safety factors. We also have exposure. I think we did a bit more work on exposure. We looked at various publications, but as you'll see in a moment, that wasn't considered adequate at the time. Yeah, there's quite a few bits missing out of this. So the acceptable risk is if the consumer exposure level, the CEL, is less than the AEL, basically. So once that work was published, the SCCS critiqued it, as they would, and I identified opportunities for improvements. One of them was to re-examine the sensitization assessment factors, and that was done through a series of workshops and completed, and the SAFs were refined. And they also said we should include aggregate exposure, because obviously fragrances aren't just in one product, they're in lots of products. And an aggregate task force, exposure task force, was set up, and an aggregate model developed in collaboration with CREM Global. Again, Anne-Marie's already mentioned this. And that QRA2 was then published in 2020. That's just a pie chart of cumulative exposure to PEA. That is actually overall exposure, so that's not specific to body areas. Clearly, we need to look at body areas, because if you're comparing a face cream and a deodorant, they're completely different body areas. They do not aggregate. So this rather busy picture shows all the body areas down the left-hand side, and this is again the exposure to PEA, and this gives you the aggregate exposure to each body part. The bars represent the distribution across that aggregate exposure. So moving on, we have a QRA2 published in 2020, but in order to do the QRA, you need to have a NESL, and in order to have a NESL, you probably need to carry out some animal studies. So the question is, do we need to do that for all fragrances, even at very tiny levels in products? Is there a threshold where we don't need to do animal studies? The idea of a threshold was originally put forward over 50 years ago by a guy called Frawley in 1967. He published a paper which he called Scientific Evidence and Common Sense as a Basis for Food Packaging Regulations. I really loved the paper. I love the use of the word common sense, because when you're doing risk assessments, you need to have some common sense. You can't just, as I say, apply it to everything. At the time, the FDA were classing any food packaging ingredients that might migrate into foods as food additive, therefore needed a full tox testing package. And Frawley said we shouldn't be doing that because the migration levels are so low, we shouldn't be actually testing everything. That concept was developed over the years into a TTC. My thoughts were, could we do that with sensitization? Can we come up with a threshold below which we don't need to do any safety testing? So this is the development of a dermal sensitization threshold. On the left, we determine the probability that an untested chemical will be a sensitizer. So not all chemicals are sensitizers. In fact, 1 in 5 are sensitizers. We also can use data from existing data from chemicals that have been tested to make a distribution. And then putting those two together, we can then determine the probability that exposure to an untested chemical at a specified level would have an acceptable risk. That is just a view of the distribution that I first produced. As you can see, most of the chemicals fall into the weak and moderate categories, quite a few in strong, and then you have quite a long tail, extreme sensitizers. That I published in 2008, so putting forward the DST as a possible route to go down. After that publication, as Anne-Marie said, we decided to get together. I don't think what I proposed in that paper was either useful or robust enough to be used. So we did some improvements. Initially, we increased the data set to 271. We then, with the help of a colleague, Nora Aptula, we split the chemicals into reactive and non-reactive. So we get 2 distributions. We also utilized Dave Roberts' expertise in chemistry to identify high potency chemicals, because we realized that top end of the distribution, there were some very potent sensitizers in there, and could we actually get rid of those using chemical structure? So the overall process was refined published in 2015. That is the overall process. So we determine the chemical structure. Is it reactive or non-reactive? If it's non-reactive, we can use the DST value of 900 micrograms per centimeter squared. If it's reactive, is it classed as an HPC chemical? If not, we can use the DST of 64 micrograms per centimeter squared. If it is, at the moment, as that paper was published, we say that we can't use that in the DST process. And I know I left RIFM in 2020, at the end of 2020, stopped working for them. I know that there's been further developments, and I think there's quite a lot of activity that has gone on regarding the DST. So the use of the dermal sensitization threshold presents a potential way of reducing unnecessary animal testing without increasing the risk to consumers. Right, I've already mentioned a few names of people I want to thank who helped me along the way. There's one major name missing from there, and that's Anne-Marie. Partly because of her expert summing up of all the discussions we had in the various working groups and actually making sense of what we discussed. But more especially regarding the DST, I think as a scientist, when I had an idea, I tended to put it out there. If somebody showed an interest, then I would carry it through. If nobody showed any interest, then it would probably get consigned to the back of my filing cabinet. And I've got quite a big filing cabinet. So Anne-Marie recognized the potential use of the DST, and she didn't run with it, but she encouraged me to run with it. So I'm really thankful that you did that, because it probably would have got consigned to the back of the filing cabinet if not. What now? Well, I've finished working for RIFM, I've finished working for Unilever, I've retired completely. That picture isn't designed to show my twilight years. That's actually a beach of somewhere that we enjoy going to regularly. So what do I do now? I love gardening. I love growing things in the garden, especially flowers. We have a dog called Bevan. I love taking him out for a walk, especially long walks. He loves long walks, and I do too. I love spending time with my family. This is us at my daughter's wedding, which was about 5 weeks ago, and actually was held on an alpaca farm in Derbyshire. I won't go through who's who. They're not all my children, but yeah. And finally, if I'm not doing any of those things, and when I get the time, then I'm probably slogging up a mountain somewhere. I say slogging, I used to say hiking, but as I've got older, it's become more slogging up a mountain. And also braving the vagaries of the British weather. So I thank you for your attention. Thanks again for the award. And thank you for listening.
Congratulations. Okay, let's dance a little bit. Yeah, we'll slog down the. Thank you very much, Bob. That was very interesting. As we're moving along, are there any questions or other matters to be discussed? I ask of you, the members. No, thank you very much. If there are no other questions or matters to be discussed, I will accept a motion to adjourn the 58th annual business meeting of RIFM members. You want it to continue? Okay, no, George, thank you. Second, Chris, thank you. All in favor? Okay, thank you very much. Meeting is adjourned. but stay seated. Anne Marie?
So we wanted to do something different this year. We wanted to highlight how RIFM science impacts what you do, our members. And we're going to do this with two different panels of staff members. The first one will highlight how our science has progressed on evaluating exposure. And the second session will talk about at least two of the tools that we have developed that not only aid us, but also help you, our members. And so we welcome any questions that you have during this time. There is a microphone here, so just raise your hand. We'd be happy to address any questions you have. And I'd also like some feedback from you at the end to say whether this was a successful deviation from our normal panel meeting, annual meeting. So please, at some time during the cocktail hour, grab me and let me know what you think. So let me start by inviting the first panel to join me up on stage. Yeah, they're going to take a
There.
Thank you. So let me introduce you to my colleagues. Olive Chan is a specialist in the communication and editing team at RIFM. Gretchen Ritako is a principal scientist leading our phototoxicity area, and she's also recently taken over leading the CREM RIFM aggregate exposure model. And Isabel Lee, of course, is a senior scientist leading the skin sensitization team. So, you know, at RIFM, our safety assessments are our product, if you will. That's what we produce, safety assessments. And you cannot, as we've mentioned a couple of times today, you cannot do a safety assessment or a risk assessment without having information about hazard and risk. So you need both parts. And about 20 years ago, when we started looking at individual safety assessments, the exposure was a very crude estimate of exposure. It was only for fine fragrances, and it was really only from 11 different companies giving us information. And because it was so crude, there was a lot of conservatisms built into it, and we took a very high percentile as the level. And we decided that we wanted to change this. We wanted a way to look at exposure, a more realistic assessment of exposure. And we wanted to include more than just fine fragrances, but all products. And so we partnered with CRIM Global about 15 years ago, and it has evolved into a strategic tool for us. But certainly what we've learned is that we are the leaders in exposure science now. There's no one else in the world, no other industry that has the information that we have and that is able to do what we do. So we are a standard for what everyone else should be doing. So just to begin with, Gretchen, can you just describe briefly what is the RIFM aggregate exposure model and what are its strengths?
Sure. The RIFM aggregate exposure model is it's a probabilistic model. It's based on real-world habits and practices data coming from the United States, from Europe, and from Singapore populations. Excuse me. It considers oral, dermal, and inhalation exposures from cosmetics, from personal care products, from household cleaning products, and from air care products. And as you said, it's a really powerful tool because it's both flexible and customizable. And this also enables us to kind of continuously improve the model.
So, I mentioned before it was only 12 companies that gave us data 20, 25 years ago. Who can respond to our surveys now?
So there's actually 2 surveys. There's probably more of the audience is familiar with our concentration surveys. Those are open to all fragrance compounders. We conduct about 5 of those each year. And that provides us with information on how much of the fragrance ingredient is in the fragrance mixture. We've actually surveyed all of our materials, so now we're in the process of resurveying because we do recognize that concentration data is not necessarily static, it can change with time. So we've committed to resurveying all our materials at a minimum of once every 5 years. We have another survey, which probably is maybe less familiar to our audience, but that's the consumer product survey. So that's open, as the name would suggest, to consumer product companies. And that provides us with information on how much of the fragrance mix is in the finished consumer product. That survey is conducted a little less frequently. That's done about every 5 to 6 years. And I think our most recent one closed earlier this year.
Mm-hmm. So you don't have to be a member of RIFM or IFRA or any of the other organizations in order to respond to our surveys, right?
Right.
So who can have access to the data?
So we actually, I noticed we have Cronin McNamara, the CEO of CRIM Global, here in the audience. So maybe, Cronin, do you want to take that question?
Thanks, Gretchen. Hello, everyone. I'm Cronin McNamara, and delighted to be here. Our passion is to make scientific models as realistic and accurate as possible and make those available and accessible in a user-friendly way to anybody who wants to use them. So this model, again, like Anne-Marie said, is available to everybody, whether they're IFRA or RIFM member. It can be a company, a compounder, or a consumer product manufacturer. Even regulators can have access to the model, and a lot of those regulators really value the model, like the US FDA uses it on a day-to-day basis. So we provide that as a service. It's a software as a service, very secure data storage and analytics, and we provide a lot of training and scientific support to help the members. And the good news is if you are a RIFM member, you get a much discounted cost to access the model and the services that we provide. So hope that helps. Thank you.
Okay. So Gretchen, this is a lot of work to respond to a survey.
Yes.
Why should somebody respond?
Well, from RIFM's perspective, without concentration survey data, we can't complete our safety assessment. We need concentration survey data to know consumers' exposure, and without exposure, as we talked about earlier, we can't determine risk. But from your perspective, from the stakeholder perspective, it's also important to provide concentration data, to provide information on your uses so that they're counted when we've identified a material with an adverse effect. In that case, we need to calculate a maximum acceptable concentration, and if you want your uses counted, when we calculate those values, it's important for you to complete those surveys. But we do recognize that it's a lot of work, and we are grateful for all the companies that participate in those surveys.
And so how has the model impacted fragrance stakeholders and consumer safety?
Well, from the model, we've learned that consumers' exposure to fragrance ingredients is really low. At RIFM, we're focused on the 95th percentile exposure, so this would be the levels that somebody who's like a super user of fragranced products would be exposed to. Even focusing on that super user, which it actually builds in a level of conservancy in our process, because in reality, we're not all super users of fragrance products. But even focusing on that super user, that 95th percentile, we have found that we are often able to waive testing because the exposure is below the threshold for toxicological concern, or the TTC, and that's a level below which there's really no appreciable risk of harm. The other thing that we use the model for is, again, when we have identified an adverse effect for a material, we use the model to help us calculate those maximum acceptable concentration levels. And I've actually now mentioned MAC levels, or maximum acceptable concentration levels, a couple times now. Isabel, as the lead of the skin sensitization endpoint, you're probably most familiar with these MAC levels. Do you want to talk a little bit about what exactly they are?
Oh yeah, right. So RIFM staff evaluates all data that we have of fragrance ingredients and writes a safety assessment. Then the expert panel for fragrance safety reviews these safety assessments and makes different safety recommendations based on whatever data they're looking at. So these could be hazard, reference doses, or exposure data. And some of the recommendations they make may include what Gretchen mentioned, the maximum acceptable concentration levels, or what we refer to as MAC. And these are just upper limits of how much of a fragrance ingredient can be used in various product categories. We've divided them roughly into 12 different product categories, and these take care of about 71 different products that we have. And then as Bob mentioned before, we have the tool, or an approach that we call the Quantitative Risk Assessment 2, that really RIFM collaborated with fragrance ingredient stakeholders to really help in the calculation of MAC levels. And this tool has been really useful to us.
And for the MAC process, it's really not just about skin sensitization. It also covers photoirritation and systemic effects like repeated dose or reproductive toxicity.
Yeah, yes, that's correct. And when we calculate MAC, so there are a lot of safety assessments that require MAC calculations, and when these are available, they're published in all of the safety assessments. However, not all MAC levels become IFRS standards. So what we've determined, and this was a part of the board conversation and decision, was that if you have MAC levels that are less than the 95th percentile exposure levels, then they would become IFRS standards. However, when these MAC levels are greater than 5 times the 95th percentile exposure level, then you wouldn't have an IFRS standard on them, but they would still go in the safety assessment. So that information is available to our membership.
So just to clarify, when we provide a MAC value to IFRA, those are the ones that become the IFRA standards, right?
That's right.
They do not change.
Right.
I think sometimes that's a misconception that they change somehow, but they don't.
Right.
And since you've worked on all of the data that we have, what trends do you see about the exposure to fragrances?
Yeah. So as Gretchen mentioned, we do resurvey our materials about every 5 to 6 years. So we look at concentration data from fragrance compounders, and also look at data from consumer product manufacturers. And then we also update the habits and practices data. So all of this information comes together to produce what we call the aggregate exposure data. And what we've seen is that this really hasn't been a significant change in exposure data with each update. So the exposure is pretty consistent. And then another observation we've made is, as we work on our safety assessments, we've seen that there's not really a lot of fragrance ingredients that are being used in consumer products. And this is an observation as scientists that we've seen, and we know that the human nose is incredibly sensitive to smell. But we wanted to kind of develop a scientific way of communicating this, and that's where the low exposure paper came in, and we did prove by looking at 3,000 fragrance ingredients that indeed exposure to fragrance ingredients is extremely low.
So we needed a criteria for saying that the exposure is low. What did we use and why did we use that?
Yeah, so we ran into a challenge when we wanted to do this study. So, I mean, we know exposure is low, but compared to what? We can really go and just, pick a random industry to compare to. Luckily, we already had a TTC as a tool. Bob already introduced it. Gretchen has talked about it a little bit. And we decided to use a TTC more as a gauge or a standard to compare all 3,000 fragrance ingredients to. And so that's the main reason that we chose the TTC. But we use the TTC quite frequently in our safety assessments, especially in combination with the read-across method that we talked about last year a little bit. And these two approaches have really helped us eliminate testing, and so far, testing of animals, and so far we've eliminated testing of about 500,000 animals.
So this is actually, it became very technical, right? Using the TTC and accumulating all of this data. And I mentioned earlier that we're trying to find ways of translating our science so in a more usable format. So Olive, tell us about the challenges and how do we face, what difficulties that we face in communicating this?
Yeah, so when we're communicating about exposure, one of the challenges that we face is in separating actual exposure from perceived exposure. Because as Isabel just mentioned, and as Anne-Marie mentioned in her talk a little earlier, we as human beings have such a sensitive sense of smell, and that often leads people to believe that they're being exposed to a lot more of a fragrance material than they're actually being exposed to. So in a lot of the communications that we send out, we work to dispel that misconception, and that's also why the low exposure paper was so important. Another challenge that we face when we're communicating about exposure and TTC is that sometimes people will hear that a material is not cleared by TTC, and they'll think that means it's unsafe. So when we're communicating about it, we have to be abundantly clear that that's not the case and that TTC is just a part of the safety assessment program. And maybe Isabel, do you want to elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so just like you said, just because a material does not clear TTC does not necessarily mean that it's not safe. We have a wealth of data in our database, and a lot of the materials we write in our safety assessments do use experimental data, or we use approaches like the one I've just mentioned, read across. So we only use TTC in the low exposure manuscript as a tool, but we have a lot of data that usually can show the materials are safe.
So part of our job was publishing the scientific paper, making it available. We've given, some of the trade press have picked it up. We've tried to spread the word as much as possible. But Olive, how can people who are here today help us to make this even more available in what they use or influencing others to learn about this information?
So can we go? Yeah, so you'll see the QR code on the screen has, it'll take you to a web page that has resources on exposure. And you'll find a link to the low exposure paper, as well as 2 Q&As on the low exposure paper and a press release on its publication. You'll also find a webinar on the RIFM aggregate exposure model. And we also have a video, which we're about to play for you in a moment. And that video is on the low exposure paper, just explaining what it's about and why it's important. And we also have a YouTube channel under RIFM Inc. So you can go to the YouTube channel and find the low exposure paper video and download it from there. So if you have any talks or presentations on exposure, we encourage you to use that video.
So before we show the video, are there any questions from you for our panel? Yep.
Hello, thank you. Tim McCarthy at Kenview. I'm going through a lot of interest needs assessments right now in our formulation. So what you just said about if the MAC value is that 1/5 rule that you use, what if it's a secondary mean? And I'm really not concerned about the secondary mean, but a nice doesn't mean that can be formed from that secondary mean. Because you said you're not creating an IFRA standard if it's below that far below the MAC.
Right, so we're not, that's an IFRA decision not to publish a standard. But if we found that a material requires a MAC value, that's published in our safety assessment. So they're always published in our safety assessment. And I think something that we have just realized is that while we are reviewing all of our materials every 5 years, if there is a MAC value in that safety assessment, we will rerun the model for those MAC. Because what we found is that if there's an adverse effect, some companies stop using that material or are using it differently than they did 5 years ago. So maybe that distribution would be very different, which is what Gretchen was saying. It's important for you to answer these surveys because we distribute the MAC based on your use. So if this ingredient is more important in fine fragrances, then it's weighted, it gives more to fine fragrances. But if suddenly 5 years later you stop using it in fine fragrances but are using it, for example, in detergents, then we want to give more to detergents. So we will be redoing those. But the MAC values, if we find that it needs a MAC value, it's published in our safety assessment. The decision to have a standard was really from the IFRA board.
Okay. But just get awareness of that. The IFRA for this, hey, notification that there's a secondary mean in this fragrance blend that's otherwise confidential, but there's a secondary mean. Very helpful in my sector. So again, it's not the secondary mean I worry about. It's not the toxicity of the secondary mean. It's the toxicity of the nitrosamine that might form
Right.
my formulation.
Right.
So if you don't have an IFRA standard that demands the fragrance house to have that transparency declaration, that's just a watch out last week.
Yep. And I believe that they do have it's been a long time since I looked at it, but I believe.
From what I understand, there are 5 aroma chemicals that are secondary means that have that IFRA standard. I don't, I'm wrong, but I think there are other secondary means that are in the entire library that might be minor use, but they don't have that mandatory declaration. Because you need the IFRA standard as a declaration.
Yeah, we can take a look at that and see if there are any. We can task the both Holger and Jake to take a look at if there's any in the inventory.
And I'd love to be wrong.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay, then can you just play the video for us?
A recent study confirms how low our exposure to fragrance ingredients truly is. With our extremely sensitive sense of smell that can detect scents in parts per billion, the equivalent of a drop of water in 27,500 gallons, humans can fully enjoy a fragrance with a minuscule amount of the fragrance-producing ingredient. The peer-reviewed study was conducted by scientists from the Research Institute for Fragrance Materials, or RIFM, in collaboration with scientific modeling and data analytics company CREM Global. The study used the CREM-RIFM aggregate exposure model, which provides a realistic calculation of consumer exposure, or how much fragrance ingredient a person comes into contact with. To calculate exposure, the model uses measured data on the daily use of fragrance products by consumers in North America, Europe, and Asia, covering a wide range of product types. The authors examined an inventory of thousands of fragrance ingredients and compared their exposure values against scientifically recognized thresholds. Using extremely conservative threshold values, the study focused on the most loyal users of fragrance products. The study found that these top-end users have extremely low exposure to fragrances, orders of magnitude below the safe use thresholds. As part of its safety assessment program, RIFM scientists have evaluated the entire inventory of fragrance ingredients using all available study data, in addition to the safe use threshold values. RIFM's assessments show these ingredients to be safe under the current conditions of use, with a high margin of safety. And because exposures are consistently being reviewed and updated, consumers can have peace of mind when using their favorite fragranced products. RIFM is an independent, non-profit research organization dedicated to scientific excellence, collaboration, and transparency. Much of our critical research relies on collaboration with fragrance safety stakeholders around the world. To learn more or to partner with us, visit rifm.org. rifm.org.
And again, you could find this, as Olive said, on our YouTube channel, and feel free to use it with customers or anywhere else that you think might be useful. So when we examined what we've done with exposure data, it just becomes evident that our commitment to safety and scientific rigor extends just beyond mere data collection. And we have developed tools and data and services that not only are what we use, but of course provide to you for our members as well. So in our second session today, we're going to talk about the RIFM Safety Assessment Program and just two of the tools that we have. And so let me introduce my panel. Danielle Botello, who's the Director of Scientific Operations, Aurelia Lapchinsky, who's the Principal Scientist leading the environmental team at RIFM, and Kristen Saxey-Vasquez, who's the Director of Technical Information and Services. So if the safety assessments are the core of what we do, we start every safety assessment by looking in the database. And the database becomes more than just a collection of different reports. It's very sophisticated. You can search by the type of study, by the author. You can look up individual materials, and there's just a wealth of information there. And they are the core of RIFM's offerings. We find more companies that actually want to join RIFM because they want access to the database. And so, Kristen, there are several global databases, and our staff regularly searches them when they begin the process of looking at the data on a particular material. What makes our database different from all the other databases?
Well, you're right. There are many other chemical databases out there, but the RIFM database is the only one of its size that's specific to flavor and fragrance ingredients. And currently there are over 7,000 materials with over 80,000 references associated with those materials. And what importantly is over 14,000 of those references are from our member company studies. So that's important. That's not data that you would necessarily find in other places, along with over 5,000 RIFM-sponsored studies as well.
And you know, the database was started before I got to RIFM, so it's older than my tenure here. And I think while there are other databases that are as old as ours, I don't think they've been maintained for 41 years, which makes it unique. So how can members best leverage the RIFM database, and what support is available to members?
Well, the staff at our subscriber companies that tend to use the database the most are the regulatory departments and the toxicologists, and they generally use it to complete client paperwork, conduct their own safety evaluations based on the various client requirements. There's regional registrations like REACH, but we've also found, because the database has chemical structures and chemical clustering information, that the R&D departments use it as well. And then I found, especially in the smaller companies, I've talked to perfumers that use the database as well. So they tend to need to wear a lot of hats in those smaller companies, so they do a little bit of everything.
And why do you consider the safety assessments on the database a member benefit?
Well, there's always going to be more safety assessments available on the database, and that's really a function of just the normal delay in publishing to a journal or an e-journal. And there's going to be safety assessments on each of the material pages, but what's really helpful is from the home page of the database, there's a listing of all the all the safety assessments that are available in the database, and it's sorted sequentially, so the most recent publications will be sorted up at the top. And that's also an indication if there's a new publication or if it's a revision, and if it's a revision, what was revised in that safety assessment. And the assessments on the database also contain more detail, and I'll let Danielle explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it really is those two things, the timing as well as the level of detail that's going to be really the benefit for accessing the safety assessments through the database. So as soon as the expert panel for fragrance safety approves something, it's getting posted to the database, and the members will be the ones to see that first. Additionally, when it moves all the way through the publication process to food and chemical toxicology, it's published as a robust summary. It doesn't have all of the key study details or other information that a member would see. And so if you want to know more about that adverse effect level, more about the very specific study details for the key studies, as well as other supporting studies that might not otherwise be cited, then you're going to want to be able to access the member version.
So the database is really not just a collection of different reports. There are different things that service our members in many different ways. For example, like the volume of use survey. And Kristen, maybe you want to expand on that.
Yeah, so the RIFM ID really is dynamic in that it is added or removed based on the IFRA volume of use survey. So if at least one company reports a material in one of the last 2 surveys, then we consider that material an active fragrance ingredient, and it either maintains or is given a RIFM ID. And that RIFM ID is important then because that is what makes it eligible for and how it becomes part of the safety assessment queue.
And if I can add it to the IFRA volume of use survey, IFRA volume of use survey is very critical for the environmental endpoint. Just like on human health, our risk assessment is also driven by the exposure, with the difference that our exposure is the IFRA volume of use survey. So that information that is provided by our members is used to calculate the predictive environmental concentrations. So we want to make sure that when you're filling out the surveys, it's a lot of questions again, another one that you have to fill it out. We want to make sure that you represent the CAS numbers and the regions that we are able to cover when we're doing our environmental risk assessment.
And I think the slides got a little bit out of order. I just want to point out that help@rifm.org is probably the easiest way to reach anyone in the database group. A couple of us have been here for many years, Mary. So most people know already how to find us, but that's the easiest way to remember, help@rifm.org. If you want to know how many more subscriptions your company has left, or if you need data for reach or just questions, data clarifications, things like that, just feel free to reach out there. And we really make an effort to answer our members within a month. Sorry, a month, that would be terrible. Within a day or so. We at least let you know we're working on it.
So, you know, I think it's important. I don't know if everyone realizes either that the information in the robust on the database, on the safety assessments, is more than what's in the published version. So that's a benefit for members. And Danielle, we've been talking about the 300 discretes and the 500 or so NCSs. So give us the status on the safety assessments.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a really long history behind the safety assessment program. We have been publishing on all of the fragrance materials in use since the 1970s. And they actually, I'm sorry, this is like giving a little feedback. I'm too loud for a microphone. You didn't need it. So no, but honestly, we started with very simple monographs back in the 70s. And so what you saw was really basic physical chemical property data, citations of the biological information, but no safety conclusions. That's what we called our monographs. But if you fast forward to the early 2000s, we began publishing in food and chemical toxicology, and these were large group summaries, so very large group of chemically similar materials, and within those groupings, the safety assessments actually included safety conclusions, and they were authored by the expert panel for fragrance safety. The current form of the program, everything you see today, is really from 2014 onward, and they're much more detailed assessments covering all of human health and environmental science. They're co-authored by the RIFM team, as well as the expert panel for fragrance safety, and include those safety conclusions. And so overall of this time of publishing on the materials, largely the materials have remained the same, but it's the science that continues to evolve. And so that's what requires us to continue to even look at and update materials, as we talked about earlier. And the team has actually evaluated everything that is in use by the industry at a bare minimum from an exposure point of view. We have looked at all of that exposure data for the naturals as well as the discretes, and so we know something about every material. There may be more testing that's needed, or there may be ongoing research efforts to bolster the methodology behind the science used in an assessment, but they have been evaluated. And as we've been celebrating today, over 2,000 of those materials are published in the current format that we have since 2014. So that's really exciting for the team.
Yes, you could tell we're really proud of that.
Yeah, a lot of work.
So the other question that we hear a lot is, if a safety assessment is not published on the material, what do we know about the safety?
Yeah, and there's a lot of that we know. And I think one of the easiest ways for a member to understand where something is in our pipeline and just at a glance what we know about a material is to be accessing the quarterly reports, which I updated today and will be launching tomorrow on the RIFM members webpage. But these are great for everyone to see at a glance, like I said, any material that's being reported. What is RIFM doing? Is it drafted, starting the pipeline process? Is it in testing? Has it been evaluated? These types of things. Has it been published? Is it on the website for you as a member or already all the way through to Elsevier? You'll be able to see that endpoint by endpoint in the reports as well as the publication status. So that's probably the best way, but of course, as Kristen says, we really do try and make sure that we can interface with you, the member. So if you had a very specific question on material that was of importance to you or a customer, it's best just to reach out to the team because we may know more detail beyond what's at that surface level in the quarterly reports.
So, we've mentioned this several times. Science is always evolving. It's not stagnant, which is why our research program is so important, to keep up with the current science and to change our methods. So I've mentioned that we have the environmental framework too. And so Aurelia, tell us how this has been updated specifically.
So RIFM environmental framework has been originally published back in 2003, I believe. And what it is a tier approach to evaluate the potential risk or lack of it, of fragrance materials in aquatic compartment. And what it does, it calculates the predictive environmental concentrations, the ratio of predictive environmental concentration to predictive no effect concentration. You literally go to tiers, and the lower tiers you require the limited number of information, just strictly your physical chemical properties and a volume. And as you move to tiers, if we clear tier 1, we can say that there's no potential aquatic risk from this material. And what it does, it allows us to eliminate those low exposure, low risk materials very early in the stages of our process. And we can really concentrate our efforts and budget into those higher tier required materials when we need additional testing, when we need additional evaluation. But also what it allows us to do is allow us to eliminate the unnecessary testing for these chemicals that are really a very low exposure and no toxicity potentials.
So probably at the next annual meeting, we'll be plugging a video on framework too.
100%.
Stay tuned. Yeah. So I also mentioned that you summarized all of the biodegradation data. So how can this be accessed?
So it's very easy. So for those who are not really familiar with the environmental endpoint, biodegradation is a very critical aspect of both risk and hazard. So whether you're a frequent user of our database, you go in daily or you go once a month, it's very easy to find the biodegradation data, and we wanted to summarize it because we want our members to have a really easy access to data that they really need. So if you go to our homepage, and straight from our homepage, you see all those different tabs. One actually says environmental data, and you can click on it, it will take you to a new window, and the new open window will take you into the Excel sheet that we're all familiar with. That will, when you open, you see the summary of all the data, biodegradation data that we have in a RIFM database. And what it does, it has the summary of the key information that are usually needed for the hazard risk. So we'll have the type of the study, it will have of course the results, the method, and the concentrations.
So when will you update this?
So yeah, it is a live document, and that's why you see it underneath, it says 2024, because this is where we last summarized it. It was actually summarized in January, that when we launched it. And biodegradation data is generated daily. We run it on RIFM side. Our members are run biodegradation data, and they provide that information to our database. Hopefully, we get it. So we want to make sure that we update the tables with the data as we get it. So once a year, we'll go in and we'll add all the data that has been added since the last update. So the hope is to get in January or February, you're going to see 2025, meaning that the data has been updated with all the information that has been inputted this year.
So we're focusing these panel sessions on the benefits to our members. So it's important for us to hear from you what you would like us to summarize, what is a need, what do you need to see? And so Danielle, how is the information organized to increase the ease and efficiency for members? Like what other examples can you share? You've mentioned a few as well.
Right, so we had already hit on briefly the quarterly reports, which gives you that at-a-glance look at where things are in the pipeline for evaluation and testing. That said, we recognize while we're being very transparent, publishing thousands of safety assessments, it's a lot of information to mine your way through. So for you as members, the benefit really is RIFM taking on the task of collating information in a much more accessible, efficient, and easy to use way. And our hope in doing that for you, right, is so that not only can you see the safety conclusion, but you can apply it more quickly to the materials that are actually in use. And so some things that we've been active in putting together, and we're developing tools to even increase the efficiency for us to do it in-house and get it to you more quickly, is we're putting together tables on the maximum acceptable concentrations, whereby you can more effectively search simply by a CAS number to see what are those values, right? It's in the safety assessment, but you have to wade through those safety assessments to find the information. How can we make that more accessible? And so we're really in the end stages of a project that will allow us to put a tool a little bit more quickly into your hands to effectively look up that information. Additionally, while we've highlighted the biodegradation data today, there's plenty of other data for us to summarize, and one that we've prioritized over the last 2 years is taking a deep dive on reproductive study data that's available, and looking specifically at effects within the endocrine system, summarizing those in a tabular format, and that would be easy to access, knowing what we know as well as what we don't know in those situations, which can be really helpful to you as the members who are using those materials. So that is not yet posted on the member site of on the RIFM.org, but that's going to be coming here in the fall.
So again, let us know what is it that you would like to see so that we can try to pull that together. Are there any questions from you? Yeah. So again, our goal this afternoon, in conclusion, was to try to bring some of the examples that what we do in completing the job that we have, our safety assessments, we bring that information to you, our members, and hoping that we can have some feedback from you, whether other things that you would need, and I hope that you have a better understanding of some of the tools and some of the summaries that we provide for you. So at this point, this would be the conclusion of our panel. Just remember to let me know if you liked this format. And you please join us in the other room for a cocktail hour. We're starting dinner at 7 o'clock back in this room. And pay attention to the cocktail napkins. So I won't say anything more than that.